The $50 bill landed beside Mason Vale's boot, fluttered once in the oily draft beneath the wing, and came to rest on the hangar floor like a small public insult. Celeste Harrow, CEO of Harrow Aeronautics, did not bend to pick it up. She only looked at the tired mechanic in the faded work shirt and said, loud enough for the pilots, engineers, executives, and ramp crew to hear, "Buy yourself lunch, Mr. Vale. This aircraft has already embarrassed people with degrees you couldn't afford." A few men looked away. One laughed under his breath. Mason did not look at the money. He looked past her toward the disabled Gulfstream sitting under the white hangar lights and listened to the thin, uneven click coming from behind the forward service panel. "That jet isn't broken," he said quietly. "It's being told not to wake up." Celeste's mouth tightened. 12 certified specialists have been here since dawn." Mason nodded once, as if that only made the matter sadder. "Then give me 5 minutes." She studied the frayed cuff of his shirt, the silver line of an old burn scar across his wrist, the worn toolbox in his left hand, and the calm in his face that she mistook for ignorance. Then she smiled with the bright, dangerous impatience of a woman who had run out of time. "Start it," she said, turning so everyone could hear her. "Start it in 5 minutes, and I'll pay you $5 million. The hangar went still. Mason finally looked at her. "Say it once more," he said. "Not for me, for the people standing here." Celeste lifted her chin. $5 million if you start that jet." Mason set his toolbox down, stepped over the $50 bill, and walked toward the aircraft without another word. That morning had begun in the kind of heat that made every metal surface in western Tennessee feel guilty by sunrise. Mason woke before his alarm in the back bedroom of the small rental house behind Vale Precision Aviation, listening to the window unit rattle and his daughter Lila moving softly in the kitchen. She was 17. Too responsible by half, with her mother's dark eyes and Mason's habit of pretending not to worry until the worry had already carved a place in her bones. On the kitchen table lay 3 envelopes Mason had turned face down the night before: a property tax notice, a payroll statement, and a final warning from the bank regarding the note on the second hangar bay. He had once maintained Air Force refueling aircraft under desert skies with sand in his teeth and jet fuel in every seam of his uniform. Now he fixed charter jets, medical transports, crop planes, and anything else that came limping into Harrow Field with a fault code and an owner who wanted the cheapest answer first. Lila was making scrambled eggs when he walked in. She had already packed his lunch in the dented cooler, along with the peach she pretended not to notice he always gave back to her in the evening. "You're going over there today?" she asked. Mason poured coffee into a travel mug that had lost its handle years earlier. "Just dropping off the bleed air regulators. And asking about the service contract." He gave her a look. She gave it back. Lila had learned young that adults often called things complicated when what they meant was frightening. The contract with Harrow Aeronautics would not make them rich, but it would keep his 4 employees paid through the winter, clear the bank's throat, and maybe let Lila start college without calculating whether each textbook equaled a week of groceries. "I'll ask if the right person is standing in the right mood," Mason said. "Dad." "I'll ask." She slid his breakfast onto a plate. "And you'll make them listen?" He smiled a little, but there was fatigue in it. "That part's never up to me." Lila stood beside him at the counter, shoulder against his arm, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, a crop duster coughed alive beyond the fence, and the day began the way most days began for Mason Vale, with more obligations than answers, and no room in the budget for pride. Vale Precision Aviation occupied an old beige block building on the far side of Harrow Field, separated from the main corporate hangars by 2 taxiways, a chain-link fence, and the invisible line that exists wherever money decides it has arrived. Mason had leased the building 8 years earlier after leaving the Air Force when Lila's mother, Naomi, got sick. He had meant the shop to be temporary, a way to stay near home during treatments, but illness had its own schedule, and after Naomi died, the shop became both livelihood and shelter. His crew consisted of Tuck Ramirez, a retired Navy metalsman with bad knees and perfect hands; Angela Brooks, who could rebuild a fuel controller blindfolded and had no patience for anyone who called her sweetheart; Eli Mercer, a quiet avionics technician who communicated mainly through raised eyebrows; and young Finn Roby, who had come asking for work after dropping out of community college and had turned out to have the rare humility to learn slowly and well. They were behind on 2 vendor accounts and waiting on payment from a charter company in Little Rock that had been promising tomorrow for 23 days. Mason loaded the regulators into his old Ford, coaxed the engine through 3 failed turns and 1 reluctant success, then drove through the service gate toward the shining corporate side of the airport. He could see the trouble before he parked. 2 security carts sat outside Hangar 1. A catering truck idled with no one unloading it. Men in white shirts moved quickly in and out of the side door, all carrying expressions that meant someone powerful was asking questions for which the machine had not provided answers. The aircraft at the center of it was the Harrow Monarch 900, a long-range business jet painted in deep pearl and silver, the personal aircraft of Celeste Harrow and the flying symbol of the company her grandfather had built from crop plane repairs into a defense and aerospace contractor with clients on 3 continents. Mason had seen the jet take off many times and had always admired the clean authority of its climb. That morning it sat cold under the hangar lights, surrounded by specialists like a queen who had fainted in public. Mason carried the regulator crate to receiving, signed the delivery tablet, and was almost out of the way when he heard the start sequence attempt through the open hangar bay. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a hesitation, a skipped breath between a relay and a permissive signal, followed by a soft abort tone almost too polite for the problem it created. Mason stopped with his hand on the crate. Listening had saved his life once. Years earlier, on a flight line outside Kandahar, he had heard a vibration under a tanker's skin that no instrument had flagged, a dry shiver beneath a pump housing that should have been smooth. A captain in a hurry had cursed him for delaying the mission, but Mason had refused to sign the aircraft out until the panel came off. They found a cracked bracket that would have torn loose under pressure at altitude. That captain never apologized, but the crew chief shook Mason's hand 2 days later and said, "You heard what the airplane was trying to say." Since then, Mason had trusted that strange gift more than he trusted badges, voices, or the confidence of men who stood too close to power. In Hangar 1, the Monarch system tried again. Mason closed his eyes for half a second and listened past the echo, past the muttered frustration, past the whine of diagnostic laptops. There it was, an intake isolation signal hanging open after the computer had already asked it to close. Not a software mystery, not a bad engine, a mechanical permission out of order, likely small enough to hide and important enough to stop $70 million of aircraft from becoming airborne. He turned back toward the hangar floor and nearly collided with Bryce Calder, Harrow's vice president of operations, a polished man with a golfer's tan, a gold watch, and the tense smile of someone who believed charm was a weapon. Mason had met him twice, both times when invoices had needed approval. "Deliveries stay at receiving," Bryce said. "This area is restricted. Your start sequence is being interrupted by a false maintenance condition." Bryce looked at him as if Mason had tracked mud across a white carpet. "That's generous of you, but we have people working on it. They're chasing software. The sound isn't software." The smile vanished. "Mr. Vale, you run a repair shed on the other side of the fence. Do not wander into a corporate aircraft emergency because you heard a noise." Mason could have left then. He had the receipt, He had no authority. He had a daughter, a failing banknote, and 4 employees who needed him too much for him to pick a fight in another man's hangar. But the aircraft tried once more, and the same wrong pause moved through the bay like a finger tapping glass. Mason looked at the jet, then at Bryce. Somebody should open the forward service panel and check the isolation flag by hand. Bryce stepped closer. Somebody should learn when silence is the safest credential. Celeste Harrow heard that last sentence. She had been standing 20 feet away near the wing, one hand pressed to the phone at her ear, the other clenched around a folder of closing documents that were already beginning to feel like evidence against her. At 46, Celeste had the controlled beauty of a woman whose life had trained her not to appear tired, even when exhaustion had moved into her bones. Her company was hours away from finalizing the purchase of Orion Lift Systems, a small but vital battery integration firm in upstate New York whose technology could move Harrow Aeronautics into hybrid regional aircraft before its competitors understood the market had changed. The purchase had taken 2 years of bruising negotiations, boardroom wars, and quiet betrayal disguised as concern. Orion's founder was elderly and impatient. The banks wanted signatures by close of business. Harrow's own board was split, with Bryce Calder leading a faction that called the deal reckless and preferred selling Harrow's regional maintenance division to a conglomerate called North Star Dominion. Celeste believed that sale would gut the company her family had built. Bryce called it freeing capital. Her father called it selling the roof to buy umbrellas. The Monarch was supposed to carry Celeste to New York with counsel, engineers, and final authority. Instead, it sat mute in her hangar while 12 people told her what the problem was not. So, when she turned and saw Mason Vale standing there in grease-dark work pants, with a delivery crate and the weary patience of a man asking to be taken seriously, she did what pressure had trained her to do badly. She measured him by the surface. She saw need and mistook it for incompetence. She saw quiet and mistook it for fear. She saw a man from the wrong side of the airfield telling her that her expensive experts had missed something simple, and she reached for the quickest way to remove him. The $50 bill came from the emergency cash folded behind her phone. She dropped it at his feet because contempt is often most efficient when it is small. The instant it left her hand, the hangar changed. No one moved. Mason's eyes did not harden, which unsettled her more than anger would have. He simply asked for 5 minutes. Celeste, desperate, proud, and certain she was about to expose him as foolish, made the $5 million bet in front of everyone. Mason worked without drama. He did not hurry for the benefit of the audience or slow down to prove importance. He washed his hands at the maintenance sink, not because they were dirty, but because machines deserved clean contact, then asked the chief pilot, Nadine Keller, to kill all attempted sequences and place the aircraft fully safe. Nadine, a former Marine aviator with gray at her temples and no affection for corporate theater, looked at Celeste. Celeste nodded. Mason opened the forward service panel with a quarter-turn tool from his bag. The panel swung out, revealing the nested architecture of sensors, harnesses, locking pins, and service tags. 3 specialists leaned in behind him until Angela, who had followed Mason across the tarmac after seeing the commotion from their shop, folded her arms near the hangar door and said, "He works better with oxygen." No one laughed, but the men stepped back. Mason touched nothing at first. He let his eyes move over the assembly. The number 3 intake service flag sat in the wrong orientation, not wildly wrong, not damaged, not broken, but rotated in a way that would require someone to remove it, overcome the natural seat, and install it backward with intention. The result would be a constant false maintenance signal. The aircraft's computer, obeying its own safety logic, would refuse ignition handoff. Mason photographed it with the company tablet, then asked Celeste, Bryce, the lead technician, and Nadine to look before he corrected it. "This wasn't vibration," he said. "This wasn't where." Bryce's jaw shifted. "Fix the aircraft, Mr. Vale." Mason did not answer. He removed the pin, inspected the seat, turned it properly, checked the adjacent sensor path with his handheld meter, and closed the panel without latching it fully. "Try the sequence," he said. Nadine moved to the cockpit. The first engine spooled. The hangar filled with a low, rising thunder that seemed to push every accusation backward into the walls. The second engine followed, smooth and even, its vibrations settling through the concrete like a deep note played on an organ. For 5 seconds, no one spoke. Celeste stared at Mason as if the world had shifted half an inch to the left, and every familiar object now required new measurement. A junior engineer whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Angela smiled with only one corner of her mouth. Mason, however, was not watching Celeste. He was looking past the engines, past the specialists, toward Bryce Calder, who stood near the executive stairs with all the color drained from his face. Celeste recovered quickly because recovery was one of the skills that had made her dangerous in boardrooms. She told her counsel to document the wager, told finance to prepare a payment authorization, and turned to Mason with a formality she used when trying to make dignity out of damage. "You did what you said you could do," she said. "Harrow Aeronautics will honor what I said." Mason heard her, but he had turned his head toward the left nacelle. There was a second sound underneath the engine's steady voice, a faint cycling tremor in the fuel feed that came and went like a pulse behind a wall. He stepped closer, eyes unfocused, listening with his whole body. Nadine looked down from the cockpit window. She had seen that posture before in old crew chiefs and experienced pilots, people who knew that instruments were records, but machines were witnesses. Mason walked to the right side, listened again, then raised one hand toward Nadine, palm flat. "Shut it down." Bryce was the first to speak. "Absolutely not." Nadine hesitated. Mason's hand did not move. Celeste's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because the first problem stopped the jet from starting," Mason said. "The second one won't." The engines wound down reluctantly. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence. Mason crossed to the monitoring station where a systems engineer named Priya Nance stood over a screen crowded with graphs. Priya had been hired by Harrow 6 months earlier after leaving a federal safety office, and she possessed the rare professional courage of someone who would rather be disliked than wrong. Mason pointed to a pressure trace most people had ignored because it stayed within acceptable range. "That wave shouldn't be there, 4 seconds apart, maybe 4 1/4. Pull the last hour of raw feed." Priya did. The graph stretched across the screen. The wave repeated, subtle but undeniable. Then, near the middle of the file, there was a break. Not a sensor failure, not static. A clean absence of 3 seconds where continuous data should have existed. Priya leaned in. "That gap wasn't there in the live monitor." "No," Mason said. "Somebody didn't want it to be." Celeste looked from the screen to Bryce. His face had regained its color, and with it came something more controlled than surprise. "This is exactly why we don't let an outside mechanic create panic inside a critical timeline," he said. His voice was calm now, ready. "Before we entertain a conspiracy, Celeste, you should know Vale's shop supplied replacement regulators for this aircraft last week. His people had service access. The accusation landed cleanly because it had been shaped in advance." Bryce explained that Vale Precision had been subcontracted for peripheral component work, that Mason possessed a vendor credential, that a desperate small business owner facing debt might have had motive to create a problem, fix it publicly, and force payment through Celeste's impulsive wager. He did not shout. He did not overreach. He placed each piece in front of her, as if helping her see an unpleasant necessity. Mason looked at him with a sadness that made Celeste uncomfortable. It was not the look of a man surprised by betrayal. It was the look of a man recognizing an old machine by its sound. Celeste hated uncertainty. She hated it more when she had created part of it. She ordered the aircraft sealed, the data systems locked, and security to hold Mason in the executive crew lounge until the access history could be reviewed. Angela took one step forward, but Mason shook his head. "Call Lila," he said softly. "Tell her I'm not missing dinner because I forgot." Angela's expression changed. She understood the sentence beneath the sentence. "Tell my daughter before rumors do." Security asked Mason for his phone and toolbox. He handed them over without protest, then walked to the lounge alone. Men who had laughed earlier now refused to meet his eyes. The $50 bill still lay near the service cart where Celeste had dropped it. No one touched it. In the lounge, Mason sat beneath a framed photograph of Harrow's first crop plane and looked at his hands. He thought of Lila at 5 years old sleeping across 2 vinyl chairs in an oncology waiting room while Naomi received treatment behind a curtain. He thought of the Air Force inquiry after the tanker incident, how the same officer who had pressured him to sign had later suggested Mason was overly cautious by temperament. He thought of the strange punishment reserved for people who refuse to cooperate with lies. They are asked to explain their integrity as if it were a suspicious object found in their pocket. He did not pace. He did not rehearse a defense. Truth, he had learned, does not improve because a man decorates it. Priya Nance began the verification with the quiet fury of a professional whose earlier doubts had just been given a shape. The regulators from Vale Precision were correctly tagged, correctly serialized, and installed in a bleed air section unrelated to the intake service flag. The reversed pin sat inside a controlled access zone reachable only through a Harrow employee credential or an executive override. Priya pulled the door logs. Mason Vale's vendor code appeared at 2:38 a.m. 2 nights earlier. Bryce Calder stood behind her when the entry appeared, saying nothing, but Celeste felt the room lean toward the obvious conclusion. Then Priya asked for secondary confirmation. She found it in a grainy camera feed from Vale's own yard, provided automatically to Harrow's insurance portal because the subcontract required shared security. At 2:38 a.m., Mason's truck was visible under the shop's sodium light, hood up, while Mason and Tuck Ramirez worked on a medevac King Air that had arrived with a failed hydraulic pump. The feed showed Mason stepping into frame every few minutes, wiping sweat with his sleeve, nowhere near Hangar 1. Someone had cloned his vendor credential. Celeste watched the footage twice. The first viewing proved he had not lied. The second forced her to look at what she had done with a $50 bill before she knew anything about him. She sent Priya to the lounge with the findings and a payment agreement drafted by counsel. Priya found Mason drinking black coffee from a paper cup, his shoulders slightly stooped, not from defeat, but from the long discipline of refusing to waste energy on anger. "They verified your alibi," she said. "Ms. Harrow is prepared to honor the $5 million if you sign a service confirmation that the Monarch is restored to airworthy condition." Mason read the document slowly. Priya watched his eyes pause at the critical sentence. He set the paper on the table. "It isn't airworthy. The start fault is resolved. The start fault was bait." Priya sat across from him. "That pressure cycle bothered me too." Mason nodded. "Then don't ask me to bless it." "I'm not asking." Her voice softened. "I'm trying to understand what you heard." For the next hour, the two of them spoke in the language of machines and consequences. Mason described the timing of the fuel pressure wave, the likely location of a false smoothing routine, and the reason a saboteur would ground an aircraft first if the real objective was something worse. Priya listened, then admitted that she had filed 2 internal concerns about fuel feed irregularities in the past 3 months. Bryce had closed both as sensor drift. She had kept private copies because she had once watched a regional carrier bury a near-miss report until a young pilot's career took the blame. Mason looked at her then, and in that look was recognition, not comfort. "People like that count on everyone wanting to keep their job," he said. Priya folded the unsigned agreement and placed it back in the folder. "And people like you? They count on us being tired." While Mason sat in the lounge, Celeste received a call from her father, Everett Harrow, who no longer held an official title but still possessed the unnerving ability to hear trouble through walls he was nowhere near. Everett was 81 and lived on a ridge outside Franklin in a farmhouse full of aviation books, old field maps, and photographs of aircraft that had outlived the men who designed them. He had founded Harrow Aeronautics with 2 mechanics, 1 hangar, and a borrowed compressor. Age had thinned his body, but not his voice. "Ground the Monarch officially," he said before she finished explaining. "Seal every data system. Bring in Meridian Federal Safety or someone equally independent. Do not let Bryce touch a wire, a laptop, or a witness." Celeste turned toward the hangar glass where the Monarch sat under bright lights like a beautiful animal suspected of illness. "You think Bryce is involved?" "I think men who want to sell a company often start by proving it can't govern itself. He's opposed Orion from the beginning. That doesn't make him a criminal." "No," Everett said, "but opposing a plan in daylight and feeding North Star Dominion in the dark are different pastimes." Celeste closed her eyes. "Do you have proof?" "Enough smoke to stop admiring the fireplace." He let that sit. "And Celeste?" "Yes, the mechanic. If he refused to sign, pay attention. People rarely turn down life-changing money unless something in them is already more expensive." After the call, Celeste did what she should have done before letting pride speak for her. She halted the New York flight, notified Orion's counsel of a safety delay, retained an independent forensic aviation firm, and ordered a full executive access freeze until credentials could be reissued. Bryce argued that the delay could destroy the acquisition. He said the board would view it as catastrophic judgment. He said competitors would smell weakness. Celeste let him speak until he had run out of polished sentences. Then she said, "The aircraft doesn't move." Bryce looked at her for a fraction too long. In that moment, she saw not anger, not worry, but calculation, adjusting itself around an unexpected obstacle. It frightened her more than any raised voice could have. By midnight, the hangar belonged to truth and fluorescent light. The catering truck had gone. The executives had thinned. The specialists who remained worked under Priya's direction, with Mason released from the lounge but still officially documented as an outside technical witness. Angela brought him his cooler from the shop and stayed because she had no intention of letting Harrow Security misplace him again. Mason called Lila from a borrowed phone. "I'm all right," he said. "That is never what people say when everything is normal," she replied. He leaned against a workbench and closed his eyes, smiling despite himself. "Fair. Did they accuse you of something?" Mason was silent too long. "They're checking facts." "Dad." He opened his eyes. Across the hangar, Celeste stood beside Priya, blazer removed, sleeves rolled, face pale with concentration. "Somebody tried to use my name," he said. "They'll fail." Lila's breath moved softly through the phone. "Do you need me?" That nearly undid him. He saw her at 8 years old putting a blanket over him when he fell asleep at the kitchen table after Naomi died. He saw her at 12 learning the shop books because he could fix engines, but not grief. He saw the future she deserved waiting just beyond the reach of money he did not have. "I need you to eat dinner," he said, "and lock the front door." "That is not an answer." "It's the one I've got." "Then come home with a better one." He promised he would. After he hung up, Celeste approached him with an expression stripped of the condescension she had worn that morning. "Your daughter?" Mason nodded. 17? "Yes. I spoke to her earlier." Mason's face changed. Why? To tell her you were safe, and because rumors had already started. He studied her. What did she say? She said I should be careful how I used the word safe. Mason looked away, and for the first time that day, Celeste felt not merely embarrassed, but small. The kind of small that does not come from being humiliated, but from recognizing that one has been careless with another person's whole life. The deeper fault revealed itself just after 2 in the morning. Priya found a hidden routine embedded inside a routine navigation update. A few lines of code designed to smooth fuel pressure anomalies during climb and early cruise, delaying cockpit alert thresholds under very specific conditions. It was not crude sabotage. It was elegant, which made it worse. A legitimate fuel pressure variance that should have produced an alert within 4 seconds could be made to look like acceptable noise for nearly 20 seconds. 20 seconds at altitude is not a number on a chart. It is a pilot troubleshooting incomplete information. It is a crew making choices with the wrong clock running. It is a family on the ground receiving a call that begins with, "There has been an incident." Mason stood beside Priya as the code appeared on the forensic screen. "This wasn't Bryce alone," he said. "No operations executive writes that." Priya's face was hard. The upload came through an executive credential. He opened the door. Someone else walked in. The independent forensic team traced the routine to a contractor packet associated with North Star Dominion, the same conglomerate Bryce wanted to sell Harrow's regional division to. It had been routed through a shell vendor approved 6 weeks earlier by operations. Celeste stared at the report until the words stopped behaving like language and became a map of her own misjudgment. Bryce had not merely tried to make her miss a closing. He had created a governance crisis, damaged the company's credibility, and left a path through which someone more ruthless could endanger an aircraft. By morning, the story had already escaped the hangar. A trade publication ran a piece about an unvetted subcontractor mechanic interfering with Harrow Aeronautics' flagship jet after a questionable verbal bonus promise. The article never mentioned the reversed PIN, the cloned credential, or the hidden alert routine. It did mention Vale Precision's debts, which no equally honest safety report would have known or cared about. 2 clients called Mason before 9 to pause work. The bank called at 10, newly concerned. By noon, a courier arrived at Vale Precision carrying an envelope from a Nashville law firm. Inside was an offer of $750,000 in exchange for Mason withdrawing from the investigation, releasing Harrow and its officers from claims, and signing a confidentiality agreement regarding events arising from disputed service activity. Mason read it at his desk while Lila stood in the doorway, arms folded. "That's a lot of money," she said. "Yes. Is it from the bad people? Usually they don't label the envelope." She stepped into the office. "Can we survive without it?" Mason looked at the bank notice, the payroll folder, the photograph of Naomi taped to the filing cabinet. Then he looked at his daughter. "I don't know." Lila swallowed. "But you're not taking it." "No, because it would make you quiet, because it would make me useful to a lie." She nodded, trying to be braver than 17 should require. "Then don't." Mason folded the letter, placed it in a plastic sleeve, and locked it in the evidence drawer. Celeste came to Vale Precision that evening without security, without Bryce, and without the armor of being expected. She drove a dark sedan herself and parked beside Mason's old Ford, where the contrast between them was almost too obvious. The shop smelled of hydraulic fluid, coffee, hot rubber, and rain on concrete. A medical transport sat in the main bay with its nose open. Tuck and Angela were working quietly, giving Celeste only the amount of attention required to let her know she was being noticed and not welcomed. Mason was under a wing removing a cracked actuator bracket. He rolled out on a creeper when her heels clicked across the floor. He did not stand immediately. The choice was not rude. It simply refused the old arrangement. "My communications office did not place the story," she said. "Bryce's assistant did. We traced it." Mason wiped his hands with a rag. "I figured. 2 clients suspended you." "3 now." She flinched. "I'm sorry. That helps less than people think." "I know." He stood then, slowly. "Do you?" Celeste looked around the shop. She saw the time cards clipped near the door, the child's old crayon drawing of an airplane pinned above the parts washer, the dented refrigerator with a college brochure under a magnet shaped like Tennessee. She saw a business that was not a brand or a line item, but a living arrangement of trust. "I'm beginning to." Mason leaned against the workbench. "Why are you here?" She opened the folder she carried and placed 3 documents on the bench. "The board meets tomorrow. Bryce is going to argue that the $5 million promise proves I acted irrationally and that you exploited the situation. He will try to remove me before the Orion transaction can continue. My father has evidence of Bryce's talks with North Star, but the safety evidence matters most. I need you to present what you found." Angela's wrench stopped turning across the bay. Mason's face remained unreadable. "Need is an honest word," he said. "People usually say request when they mean need. Then I need you." The quiet after that sentence stretched. Celeste lowered her eyes. "I also need to apologize. Not as a strategy. Not because my father told me to. I dropped money at your feet because I thought I knew what kind of man you were by looking at your shirt. That was cruel. It was also foolish. I cannot undo it." Mason looked toward the office where Lila was pretending to organize invoices while listening to every word. "No," he said. "You can't." Celeste nodded once, accepting the full weight of the answer. "What can I do?" "Tell the truth before it benefits you." She looked back at him. "In front of whom?" "Start with your people." The next morning, Celeste stood on a maintenance platform in Hangar 1 before nearly 400 employees, with cameras recording and legal counsel visibly unhappy near the wall. She did not use a prepared statement. She described the failed start, the wager, the $50 bill, the reversed PIN, the hidden software routine, and the false implication of Mason Vale. Then she told them what mattered most. "Yesterday morning," she said, her voice steady but not polished, "I treated a man as if his worth could be measured by my impatience. He responded by protecting an aircraft, my company, and the people aboard a flight that should not have flown. When given a document that would have made him rich and made my problem convenient, he refused to sign because it was not true. That refusal did more for Harrow Aeronautics than my authority did." No one clapped. It was not that kind of moment. The hangar absorbed the words. Some employees looked toward Mason, who stood near the back with Angela and Priya, hands in his pockets, expression lowered. Others looked at Bryce, who stood beside counsel with a face arranged into neutrality. Celeste finished by announcing independent oversight, full cooperation with federal authorities, and protection for any employee who had previously raised safety concerns. Priya's jaw tightened at that, and Mason noticed. Bryce noticed, too. The board convened that afternoon in the old executive conference room overlooking the runway, the one with photographs of Harrow aircraft from 7 decades lining the walls. Bryce arrived with 2 attorneys and a counter-narrative dressed in governance language. Celeste had made an unauthorized multi-million-dollar promise. She had allowed an outside mechanic to interfere with a security-sensitive investigation. She had jeopardized a critical acquisition by grounding an aircraft over speculative concerns. He spoke for 20 minutes and sounded almost reasonable if one ignored the evidence. Everett Harrow sat at the far end of the table, frail under a navy cardigan, eyes sharp enough to cut paper. When Bryce finished, Everett slid a folder forward. Inside were call logs, draft advisory agreements, and correspondence tying Bryce to North Star Dominion's acquisition team, including a conditional consulting role worth more than Mason's entire shop. Everett did not raise his voice. "My granddaughter made one mistake in public," he said. "Bryce made many in private." Celeste then placed her own folder on the table. The cloned credential proof, Priya's archived anomaly reports, the forensic code analysis, the media leak trail, and the settlement offer sent to Mason. She did not defend the $50 bill. She did not soften it. "If the board decides the $5 million is mine to pay personally, I will pay it," she said. "But before you decide what my mistake cost, look at what Mr. Vale's refusal saved." Mason entered only when asked. He wore the same work shirt from the shop, clean but permanently marked by years of labor. He did not bring a lawyer. He did not bring a speech. Priya connected his simulation to the conference screen. Mason showed the board the hidden alert routine under controlled conditions. First the restored software, then the modified version. On the restored system, warning lights appeared in 4 seconds and routed to both cockpit displays. On the modified system, the pressure anomaly remained visually dampened while the seconds counted upward in the corner of the screen. 5, 8, 12, 16. At 21 seconds, the first caution appeared. "At cruise altitude," Mason said, "that delay is not an inconvenience. It changes the crew's choices. It changes the shape of the emergency." A board member asked whether he could prove the aircraft would have crashed. Mason looked at him for a long moment. "No, sir. And I'm grateful for that. Safety work is supposed to prevent the kind of proof that comes with wreckage." The room went quiet. Bryce's attorneys tried to suggest that Mason's interpretation was emotional and outside his formal role. Priya answered before Mason could. She laid her credentials on the table, then her archived reports. "His interpretation matches the data," she said. "Mine too. I raised concerns before and they were closed improperly." Celeste watched the board members shift, not because they suddenly liked her, but because facts had tightened around the story until there was little room left to stand elsewhere. By evening, Bryce Calder had been suspended pending investigation for securities fraud, material misrepresentation, unauthorized access facilitation, and conspiracy related to the attempted manipulation of the Orion transaction. North Star Dominion denied knowledge of any improper software routine, which no one in the room believed and no one could yet prove. The Orion deadline, it turned out, had been more flexible than Bryce had claimed. He had exaggerated the urgency to force Celeste into the air and then into failure. The board voted to continue the acquisition under independent review and to classify Mason's $5 million as an emergency safety award rather than a wager. Celeste signed the authorization with a hand that did not tremble until she was alone in the restroom afterward, gripping the sink while the woman in the mirror looked less certain than she had in years. Mason did not spend the money the way people expected. He paid the back wages he had been quietly delaying from his own draw, cleared the vendor accounts, settled the banknote on the second bay, and placed enough in the operating account to protect 6 months of payroll. He set aside Lila's college fund in an account that made him stare at the confirmation page for a long time before closing the laptop. The remainder went untouched while the investigation continued. When a local reporter asked whether he felt vindicated, Mason said only, "I'm glad nobody flew that aircraft." It was not the quote the reporter wanted, so she wrote around it. Lila read the article at the kitchen table that night and made a face. "They keep calling you humble. That's a complaint? It makes you sound like a golden retriever." He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. Lila smiled into her glass of water, relieved in a way she did not know how to say. Later, after dishes, She found him on the back steps holding Naomi's wedding ring between his fingers. He had worn it on a chain after she died until the chain broke. Now he kept it in a small metal box and took it out when decisions felt too large. Lila sat beside him. Mom would have said take the money and buy new boots first. Mason looked at the cracked leather across his toes. She always hated these boots. Everyone hates those boots. He turned the ring once. I wish she could see you. Lila leaned her head on his shoulder. She can. I think she'd also tell you to stop acting like accepting help is a moral failure. Mason closed his fingers around the ring. Out beyond the yard, runway lights blinked in the dark. I'm working on that. Slowly. Accurately. She groaned. That is such a mechanic answer. But she did not move away, and he did not ask her to. The full technical review took 6 weeks. Bryce's assistant cooperated after receiving immunity for limited testimony. The cloned credential had been generated through an operations override and planted in the access log by a security administrator who claimed he believed he was helping with an internal audit. The reversed intake flag had been installed by a maintenance supervisor under Bryce's direction, a man drowning in gambling debt and promised rescue in exchange for what he was told would be a harmless delay. The hidden software routine had entered through a North Star-linked shell contractor, and while the investigators were careful with language, the pattern was clear enough that Harrow terminated every related vendor agreement and referred the matter to federal authorities. Priya's earlier reports became central to the findings, not because they had stopped the event, but because they proved the warning signs had existed before Mason heard them. Celeste asked Priya to become Chief Safety Officer. Priya accepted only after negotiating direct reporting access to the board and legal protection for independent findings. Mason approved of that, though he would never have put it that way. Everett offered Mason an executive position twice. Director of Field Safety first, then Senior Vice President of Maintenance Integrity when Celeste argued the title needed enough authority to matter. Mason declined both. He met Celeste and Everett in the old conference room with Priya present and proposed something different. Vale Precision would become the foundation for an independent inspection and training center funded by Harrow but governed by a charter that prevented Harrow executives from altering, suppressing, or delaying technical findings. Technicians from Harrow and outside operators could train there. Employees could bring safety concerns there without passing through supervisors. Audit results would go simultaneously to Harrow, regulators, and the Independent Safety Board. Everett listened with his hands folded over his cane. Celeste listened with the expression of a leader recognizing that trust, once damaged, cannot be repaired by asking people to trust harder. You're asking me to pay for an institution that can tell me no, she said. Mason shook his head. I'm asking you to build one that people believe when it says yes. Everett smiled faintly. That may be the best sentence said in this room in 20 years. Celeste agreed to the charter. Some board members resisted. Investors questioned the optics. The trade press called it an unusual concession. Celeste called it necessary and let the word stand without ornament. The $50 bill became a problem because no one knew what to do with it. For 3 days it remained sealed in an evidence sleeve in Priya's office, tagged and photographed, until Celeste asked Mason whether he wanted it. No, he said. It was never mine. I don't want to hide it. Then don't. She had it framed in plain glass and hung in the training room of the new Vale Harrow Safety Center, beside no plaque and beneath no explanation. During the first technician orientation, a young apprentice raised his hand and asked why a $50 bill was on the wall. Mason, standing at the front in a work shirt that still refused to look new, looked at Celeste. She had come to the session without cameras. She stood. Because I once confused authority with judgment, she said, and because the man teaching this class chose not to confuse money with truth. The apprentice nodded, as if that answered more than he had asked. In the months that followed, the center grew faster than Mason expected and more carefully than Harrow's public relations team preferred. He hired Tuck as lead practical instructor, Angela as inspection supervisor, Eli to build a secure avionics lab, and Finn to manage apprentices while pretending he was not proud of the title. 3 Harrow technicians who had worked under the disgraced supervisor applied for positions and were accepted only after completing the same certification review as everyone else. Mason kept the old shop open across the field. "You have a whole center now," Lila said one Saturday while helping him repaint the old office. "This place smells like burnt coffee and old socks. History. Mold. Character." She rolled her eyes, but she painted carefully around the old crayon drawing of an airplane she had made at 7. Mason noticed and said nothing. Some things survived because no one made them prove their value. Celeste changed too, though not in a clean, cinematic way that could fit into a headline. She still made hard decisions. She still frightened weak vendors and impatient bankers. She still wore tailored blazers, and spoke in sentences that left very little room for nonsense. But she began asking different questions in meetings. Who disagrees? What are we not seeing? Who signed this under pressure? She met monthly with technicians without their supervisors present, and learned that silence in a company is rarely proof of agreement. Often it is only proof of rent, medical bills, tuition, and fear. Her relationship with Mason grew slowly, without announcement, and without the cheap sparkle that gossip tried to give it. She came by the shop some evenings after board meetings, not to be seen but because the place steadied her. Mason would be working under a cowling or reviewing apprentice logs, and she would sit on an overturned crate with coffee from the vending machine, asking questions that were sometimes technical and sometimes not. He learned that her certainty had been armor-built after years of being treated as an heiress rather than an engineer, a woman expected to inherit but not understand. She learned that his quiet was not emptiness, and his restraint was not weakness. Once, during a thunderstorm that shook rain against the hangar doors, she asked whether he ever got angry about what had happened. Mason took a long time answering. "I got angry when they dragged Lila into it," he said. The rest was mostly familiar. Celeste looked at the concrete floor. "That makes it worse." "Yes. I don't know how to forgive myself for that morning." Mason tightened a bolt, checked the torque, and set the wrench down. "Forgiveness isn't a place you arrive because you feel bad enough. It's a direction. Walk it." She looked at him then, and something unguarded passed between them. Not romance exactly, though perhaps the first honest material from which such a thing could one day be built. Neither of them reached for it. Both had learned what happens when people move too quickly around fragile systems. The Monarch 900 returned to service on a bright November morning when the air had finally cooled enough to make Tennessee feel merciful. The certification flight was scheduled for 9. Regulators, Harrow executives, independent observers, and reporters gathered near the fence line. Celeste offered Mason a seat aboard the initial flight. He declined before she finished the sentence. "I've got work," he said. She looked amused. "You always have work." That's how aircraft stay in the sky. Instead, he drove Lila to the service road beyond the runway with Angela, Tuck, Finn, and Eli piled into 2 trucks behind them. Lila had been accepted to an engineering program the week before and had not yet decided whether to admit she was terrified. She stood beside Mason at the fence, hands hooked through the chain links the way she had when she was little. "You could have flown on it," she said. "I know. You fixed it. A lot of people fixed it." She gave him a sideways look. "You are exhausting," he smiled. Across the field, the Monarch began its taxi. Its engines rose in a clean, confident sequence, not forced, not fooled, every system answering in the order it should. Mason listened. So did Lila, though she pretended not to. The jet turned at the threshold, paused, then accelerated down the runway. Sun flashed along its fuselage. The nose lifted. The main gear left the earth. For a moment, the aircraft seemed suspended between the past and whatever came next. Then it climbed into the pale morning sky with the calm authority of a machine finally permitted to tell the truth. Celeste sat by the window, not in triumph, but in remembrance. She looked down and saw Mason by the fence with his daughter, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his attention already shifting from the aircraft to something Lila was saying. He did not wave. He did not need to. Some people spend their lives asking the world to recognize them. Others hold the line so quietly that recognition arrives late, embarrassed, and forever changed. Years later, visitors to the Vale Harrow Safety Center would still ask about the framed $50 bill. By then, the Orion acquisition had succeeded. Harrow's hybrid program had become the company's strongest division. Pria's safety protocols had been adopted by operators far beyond Tennessee, and Mason's apprentices had scattered into hangars, bases, and maintenance shops across the country, carrying his stubborn reverence for the unsigned truth. The story became cleaner in retelling, as stories often do. People said a poor mechanic won $5 million from a proud CEO. They said he fixed what 12 experts could not. They said he exposed a corporate betrayal and saved a jet. None of that was false, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was quieter. A man with bills on his table and a daughter watching his every compromise had been offered more money than he had ever imagined. First as mockery, then as reward, then as hush money, and each time he had asked not what the money could buy, but what accepting it would make him sign. A woman who commanded rooms had been forced to see that leadership without humility becomes another kind of blindness. A company that believed safety lived in procedures had learned that procedures fail when frightened people cannot speak. And a child who had seen her father swallow humiliation without becoming small carried that lesson into her own life like an inheritance no court could measure. Mason never framed the $5 million check. He never bought a new truck until the old Ford finally surrendered on the shoulder of Highway 64 in a cloud of steam and dignity. He never learned to enjoy interviews. But sometimes on quiet evenings, he stood in the doorway of the old shop and listened to the field. Turbines winding down, tools ringing faintly, apprentices laughing, rain ticking on the roof. His daughter's voice on the phone telling him about structures, systems, stress points, and all the invisible forces that determine whether something holds. On those evenings, Mason would look across the runway toward the bright windows of the safety center, where the $50 bill hung without explanation, and he would feel no bitterness. The bill had not bought his silence. It had purchased, at great cost to the woman who dropped it, the first honest lesson in a room that needed one. And that was enough. Because dignity, Mason had learned, is not the noise a man makes after he is vindicated. It is the work he refuses to abandon before anyone believes him. In Mason Vale's saga, we discover that dignity is earned not by applause or bank balances, but by the quiet choices we guard when no one is watching. First mocked with a $50 bill, then tempted with $5 million, and finally offered hush money. This single dad weighed each offer against the cost of his integrity and chose truth every time. That stubborn honesty exposed sabotage, saved an aircraft full of strangers, and nudged a powerful CEO from arrogance toward humility. The lesson is clear. Our true worth surfaces in the moments we could compromise and don't. Courage often whispers instead of shouts, and one principled voice can reset the moral compass of an entire company. If you've ever faced a crossroads where doing the right thing felt lonely or expensive, remember Mason. Your quiet stand may be the hinge on which someone else's safety, hope, or future turns. What moment in your life demanded that kind of silent bravery? Share your story in the comments below so we can learn from each other and grow as a community. And if narratives of everyday heroism move you the way this one moves me, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next life-changing lesson is already on its way.